today we're very lucky to have with us the president of our foundation, Pascal, Dr. Pascal Bastien. Pascal is currently a staff internist at the Department of Medicine at Queensway Carleton Hospital in Ottawa. He was, until just a few months ago, also the division head for general internal medicine at North York General Hospital. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine, and he does some instructing there, and also a graduate of the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine. So we're very privileged to have him here today. And he's a Eastern Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic as well, a great friend of our institute, and so please welcome Pascal Bastien.
Thank you, Father. Slava Jesus Christou, Lord Jesus Christ. That sounds like the reverse. In the sense that I'm normally answering to clergy saying this. It's a bit of it's a special opportunity for me to be able to speak to you, members of our clergy, obviously, on a topic that is unfortunately very important, not only to physicians, but certainly to all Canadians, and certainly to any Christians, and certainly to you pastors. The topic of today's talk, or the title anyway, will be the normalization of euthanasia in Canada. The cautionary tale continues. It is in part inspired on an article that close friends of mine wrote for the World Medical Journal, the link for which was sent to you earlier. I'm going to try to cover a lot of grounds. There is so much to be said on euthanasia, and obviously I do want to stick to the time constraints and leave a bit of time for questions or conversation. And so you'll have to forgive me in advance for not maybe touching every point that you deem important. Please bring up what you want in the question period. It does not have to be directly connected to what was said. I hope everyone can hear me fine and see the slides. Here, I'm learning how to use this device. Okay. So the overview of today's talk, we will talk a little bit about euthanasia terminology, because indeed there are specific words that are used rightly or wrongly when we talk of euthanasia in the secular world. In fact, the word euthanasia, you'll note in the medical context today in Canada, does not actually come up very often at all. We will try to contextualize Canada's position. Canada is really at the forefront of this progressive culture, dare I say culture of death, that has gone, of course, much beyond the quote-unquote women's rights of abortion to now fully adopt a culture where life should only be continued when it's pleasant and desired, and where really any desire to end one's life should be assisted by the medical profession. We will talk about how conscience is under attack. Of course, I'll be speaking specifically about the medical context, but we know that there are other clear examples of that in Canada. The lawyers of this country have had a similar problem not long ago. We will talk about how MAiD is being expanded through Bill C7. And if you've not heard of Bill C7, then I'm happy that you're on this call, because as Canadians who care about life, unfortunately, we have to be informed on this very unpleasant topic. We will talk about some of the lies, the misleading information around the question of choice. And I left this maybe provocative last statement. What Matt said, I leave that intentionally vague, and a call to action for life, ending, of course, on a positive note, because we have the gospel on our side, and ultimately life will triumph. So on with our first formal section, bad terminology or the seeds of confusion. On the right, we see an icon of the Tower of Babel, of course, where due to miscommunication and incomprehensible languages, the peoples of the world first started to have a chaos between them. And I think that something very similar is happening in the context of the communication and the words we are using in euthanasia. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it is very intentional. It's part of the playbook of the euthanasia promoters to use language in a way that is softened or sometimes flat out misleading. So of course, the term by which we reference the intentional ending of one's life for the purpose of relieving suffering in Canada is MAiD. Essentially, that is the only thing you hear in the hallways of hospitals. No one says the full term medical assistance in dying. No one says euthanasia. No one talks about physician-assisted suicide. We stick to a one-syllable word, which is MAiD, and it's an acronym. And an acronym is the first step, I think, in just distancing oneself of what we're actually referencing. It's an acronym for an expression, medical assistance in dying, which, if you listen to it carefully, is a beautiful thing. Should we not be using our medical science, our knowledge in the field of medicine to assist dying people? Should we not all be assisting dying people? This is a good thing. But of course, medical assistance in dying, which really should be referring to essentially palliative care, which we know is a good thing and fully supported by the church, is not in fact what medical assistance in dying is referencing. Medical assistance in dying is very specifically speaking of two concepts: the concept of euthanasia, where a physician, a clinician, is administering the death through lethal injection, or physician-assisted suicide, where patients are provided with a prescription that they can then use at their leisure, at the moment of their choosing, perhaps after having a lunch with their family at the top of a mountain, to end their life that they had deemed too burdensome to continue. And so MAiD is an umbrella term for both of these. More misleading terms. So the term dignity, of course, has been completely hijacked, and it's been hijacked by the largest euthanasia promotion group in our country, which is named Dying with Dignity. If you've not heard about them, you probably haven't turned on your television in the last few years, and maybe that's a good thing. Of course, Dying with Dignity, again, nothing hugely problematic if we only listen to the words, but once we start understanding what they reference, they have a very, very destructive understanding of what dignity is. They are referencing the notion of dying with dignity to suggest that once we are frail, once we are ill, once we are in a suffering state that isn't as good as we would like it to be, we have somehow lost our dignity. And of course, since I'm speaking to clergy, I'm allowing myself to say, without too much of an introduction, that this is, of course, completely contradictory with the Christian understanding of the human person, created in the image of God, and of course, de facto as a gift which has received inherent dignity from the moment of conception, of course, and up until a natural death. There is nothing in the human person that can strip it from its dignity that is a gift from God. Dignity is not external propriety, to borrow an expression of Cardinal Collins. The idea that it depends on us having good looks, or having a large investment portfolio, or driving a nice car, or being well-spoken. That is not what makes us worthy of dignity. And I place the icon of the cross on the right-hand side to just emphasize the fact that, if this was dignity, then we would have to believe that Christ, by taking on the cross, by first becoming human flesh and then accepting the cross, would of himself not be worthy of dignity, which is absurd. And yet 1 Corinthians talks to us about the fact that the cross is foolishness to the Greeks, suggesting that if we do have a merely superficial or exterior approach to life, then this is how we think. And we think that, and we're prone to thinking like that today, just like the Greeks were prone to thinking like that 2,000 years ago. Take-home message number one: the debate around euthanasia weaponizes false and misleading terminology. There are some really precious terms, including human dignity, that Christians need to reappropriate. These are Christian terms at their root, but they have been transformed to meaning something false and evil. And euthanasia and assisted suicide, while use and suffering, are forms of willful killing. And anyone who doesn't fully appreciate that, and sometimes patients may not fully appreciate that when they are being offered MAiD, need to, of course, be informed of that. Why is MAiD becoming why is euthanasia becoming such an issue today and not before? So, people will talk about how, because we have human suffering around us, we need to have euthanasia. That's the compassionate thing to have. Another word, of course, that has been hijacked. And of course, this is untrue. The very word patient comes from the Latin patientem, which means suffering. the patient is he who suffers, she who suffers, the suffering, injured, or sick person. And medicine for many centuries was really a somewhat powerless art that accompanied suffering people with very minimal understanding of what was going on, and even fewer tools to alleviate this suffering. And yet, euthanasia for centuries and centuries was not being promoted as something desirable. Why now then? Well, if we listen to the story of the Rodriguez case, we hear that Ms. Rodriguez had access to excellent palliative care in the early 1990s, but she wanted to live until she decided it was time to die. Here, under the refrain of control. Palliative care can't give you control or choice, and that is what Ms. Rodriguez wanted. This is from an article in the Globe and Mail that was not a pro-life article by any stretch, but just summarizing the history. And that is very important. Palliative care is in fact extremely effective at controlling physical pain. And I will say that because I'm speaking to a non-medical crowd. I will tell you that even my colleagues who support euthanasia, fellow internists who work at the hospital with me, who have no problem with euthanasia, are still very clear in their mind that it's not about physical pain, because we can control physical pain better than ever before, certainly better than in all the centuries of the last 2,000 years where euthanasia was not being performed. And secondly, euthanasia is requested still because of pain. It's existential pain. And because our secular materialistic society really does not have an answer for existential pain, ending life seems like an attractive solution. Okay, Canada is so enthusiastic about this new truth, this new ideology, that it seeks to promote it elsewhere in the world. There's no doubt. There's already, there are many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of our taxpayer dollars in Canada that are going towards the promotion of quote unquote women's rights in Africa, like a new form of colonization, whereby we are telling countries that are poorer than our own that if they want our aid, they need to adopt our understanding of how families should be run and how sexuality should be run. This is already one big part of our foreign policy, but a new one is the promotion of euthanasia. So we have, of course, a few allies in the world, but Canada is more aggressive than countries like Belgium and the Netherlands to spread this. And so at a recent 2018 meeting of the World Medical Association, the Canadian delegation was very keen to have the code of ethics of the World Medical Association amended in such a way that euthanasia would be deemed ethical, would be deemed a wonderful thing, because Canada does not like to be told by the World Medical Association that actually this is not an ethical practice, and Canada falls outside, therefore, of the realm of ethical practices. When it realized that it couldn't do that, the CMA actually stormed out of the meeting, and the CMA head stormed out of the meeting, and later came up with some totally bogus reason why Canada would have to actually leave the World Medical Association altogether. So the Canadian Medical Association, just so you know, it doesn't affect your everyday life, no longer is part of the World Medical Association, essentially in reality because of a dispute over the code of ethics. This is, you can imagine the degree of energy that we have and conviction that we have, the light, and we are so frustrated when others are not willing to understand this with us. Take home message number 2, the push for euthanasia does not stem from uncontrolled physical suffering, which can be controlled thanks to advances in palliative care. The push for euthanasia stems from existential suffering. Okay. Take home message number 3, right there. Canada is leading the promotion of progressive values on the world scene. And after the right to choose, this now officially includes the rights to die according to one's desire, which will be further defined in Bill C7 that we will talk about today. Moving on to conscience rights. So it's important to note that when the Carter decision was made, very shortly thereafter, there was an important policy of the College and Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, the college that regulates the entire medical profession in this province. I'm not sure if we have out of province clergy here, but certainly in Ontario, this is the key, a key document. that had been previously written but was amended just as the Carter decision was coming into place. And it all hinged on the notion, the only change in the revised policy hinged on the notion of effective referral. And so the idea is, if you are a scrupulous physician, so stubborn that you're not going to be willing to offer everything that is in fact legal according to the state, according to Ontario, then at the very least, we request that you provide a direct referral, that you recommend to your patient to go to a different physician for this quote unquote medical service. The text of the policy reads, where physicians are unwilling to provide certain elements of care for reasons of conscience or religion, an effective referral to another healthcare provider must be provided to the patient. An effective referral means a referral made in good faith to a non-objecting, available, and accessible physician, other healthcare professional, or agency. And of course, I hope that you're seeing from the image on the right that, the notion of a referral, which in French is recommandation, the notion of a recommendation of a given treatment with another physician still involves you as a physician in a cogwheel. You have to put your signature saying, please consider my patient so-and-so for this. And this, in this case, is to kill him. And that is obviously being complicit to an action that in this case is problematic. And because we have the Simpsons series, which is a very good resource in terms of theological and bioethical information, I allow myself, even in this presentation addressed to clergy, to keep a slide I used for a more secular audience on the episode entitled King Size Homer. And I think some of the clergy may still have seen this episode, so hopefully you can follow along. Dr. Hibbert, the physician looking after Homer Simpson, is being asked by Homer whether he could help him gain an enormous amount of weight. He's already a bigger man, but gain an enormous amount of weight so that he would benefit from all sorts of additional disability benefits. And Dr. Hibbert answers, "That's monstrous. I've never heard of anything so negligent. I'll have no part of it." To which Homer replies, "Can you recommend a doctor who will?" And Dr. Hibbert immediately says, "Yes." And this is wisdom that comes from popular culture. This is cooperation with evil. In this case, it would be termed in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, proximate, mediate, material cooperation, which we are told, and we can understand, is always sinful. The Carter case came just before, as we said, and struck down the existing legislation that made euthanasia illegal in this country. And yet we were told nothing in this declaration would compel physicians to provide assistance in dying. The charter rights of patients and physicians will need to be reconciled in any legislative and regulatory response to this judgment. Now, Ontario became a unique place. It became a place where simultaneously euthanasia was legal and physician consent rights had been effectively eliminated. And while, again, as we said, euthanasia exists in many other jurisdictions, physician-assisted suicide exists even in some American states, the combination of euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and absent conscience rights for physicians is a uniquely Ontarian concept. And because of this, in the span of just a few months, physician involvement with MAiD went from being punishable under the criminal code to being, in fact, mandatory by the college, without which you could very much lose your license. Interestingly, I'm just throwing that out there because of it, I think that understanding the full cultural ramifications is interesting. Around the same time, Ontarians were lamenting, I think largely with reason, the Quebec Charter of Values, where a very aggressive tone was being used to hide any visible signs of religion in the province of Quebec. And this is an ad that I remember seeing in 2013 where Lakeridge Health, a large Toronto hospital, was encouraging people to come to work for them, saying, "We don't care what's on your head," showing they respect freedom of religion. Interestingly, around the same time, the CPSO had another idea. They also did not care what was on your head, but they certainly wanted to make sure that you would ignore what was inside it, right? So on one hand, we pride ourselves as Ontarians as being so open-minded, and immediately after we say, well, very crucial limits to what that freedom actually is, which I would argue is more problematic than the external appearance, although both are important. Conscience is a real thing. It was acknowledged throughout humanity in all previous cultures and geography and time, and lots could be said about that. Conscience is not a matter of feelings. It's not a matter of scruples. It's not a matter of saying, well, I don't really want to dirty my hands to meddle with this, so I'm just going to say no to this patient. It has to do with responding to a law written in our hearts. The epistle to the Romans, what St. Paul writes to the Romans, referencing the fact that the Gentiles who did not actually have the law still responded to a law written in their hearts. And how to understand this law written in the heart, if not conscience, right? Cardinal Newman spoke of conscience as the aboriginal vicar of Christ, meaning before even written revelation, there is in us the truth that is written in our hearts. And this truth, this one truth with a capital T, of course, is Christ himself. And the word conscience comes from, in English, Latin, conscientia. In Greek, I believe it's synderesis. And in Church Slavonic and Ukrainian, you guys can check, it all works. It means joint knowledge. Joint knowledge, even though sometimes we might think of conscience as being a very personal thing, but in fact, no, joint knowledge with the divine persons for the purpose of joint action with them. And indeed, conscience allows us, conscience is not just a rule book, it allows us in real time to evaluate the circumstances in front of us. What does the modern world say about conscience? Well, amazingly, in 1948, after the horrors of the Second World War, when the UN was created, one of the first things it did is to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the very first article of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is on freedom of conscience. And Canada, on the other hand, has the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it has at the beginning of it 4 fundamental freedoms. And the first of the 4 fundamental freedoms is freedom of conscience. Another fundamental freedom is freedom of religion, which I just bring up to say that conscience and religion, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion are not in fact the same thing, although some adversaries, some opponents of freedom of conscience often intentionally want to conflate the two. But the purpose of this slide is just to highlight that we have some pretty solid secular documents rooted in the horrendous history of the 20th century and the totalitarian regimes that have said, you know what, we need to remind people that no matter what a state tells you, there is always a law written in your heart. You always have your conscience. And we know from the Nuremberg trials that it doesn't matter if you do something that is legal according to your country's false laws, you will still be told that what you did, even in human terms, you'll be told that what you did was wrong if it goes completely against conscience. But conscience is under attack. Leading bioethicists in Canada, including Udo Schucklink, which is the Queen's professor, which is a Queen's University professor and Ontario Research Chair in bioethics, so he holds a fairly prestigious position, tells the National Post and others that are willing to listen that conscientious objection is no more than self-serving, non-moral aversion. That physicians who say, I cannot refer you or I cannot perform euthanasia on you, and while I'm willing to accompany you in all sorts of other ways, and while I'm willing to explore all other options with you, and I'm willing to respect your right to seek euthanasia, but I cannot participate in any way in it, that is self-serving, non-moral aversion, a form of scrupulous disdain for the patient ultimately. He compares the objecting physician to a racist or a homophobe. Also, I think intentionally in his case, making a grievous mistake, because of course conscience never causes us to say anything against someone. The racist is someone, the racist and the homophobe are against people. They have negative thoughts and actions against people. We are never in good conscience encouraged to do anything evil against people, but we do in conscience have to say certain things, certain actions are right and certain actions are wrong. And stating that is not a form of evil of any kind. If we don't speak the truth and we don't call evil evil, that would be a problem. And you cannot compare calling something evil as behaving in an evil fashion. He has no problem calling our legislators to say that our attitude should be one of shape up or ship out, meaning either you change and you drink the Kool-Aid, you start behaving like we're telling you is now the new morality, or you get out of the profession. And this is how we should be handling medical professionals in his case. He also says that conscientious objection is nothing other than protection for Christian doctors. I was alluding to this intentional conflation between freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. And that's simply inaccurate. There are many Sikh colleagues of mine and Jewish colleagues of mine who have stood up and continue to stand up against participation in euthanasia and evoke their own freedom of conscience. There are secular humanists, non-religious physicians who do the same. So it's an inaccurate statement. But even if it were accurate, and while freedom of conscience is separate, there is a precedent in Canada for trying to exclude a certain religious group from the practice of medicine. There is in numerous older universities in Canada, the history of the Jewish quota, whereby up until the 60s, there was an intentional restriction of the number of medical trainees of Jewish background. I had a patient in Toronto who was a retired surgeon who had to train in Geneva, and he explained to me when we met, when we had a lovely conversation, he explained to me that he had no choice but to go to Switzerland for, I think, a decade to train in medical school and so on, because in his year, McGill University had reached this quota. And I think that Canada is appropriately ashamed of this former practice and should not be embracing the encouragement of moving into this trend nowadays again. Take home point number 4, conscience is a real thing. It is the cornerstone of our secular society's understanding of rights and freedoms, and it is absolutely being relegated to the realm of the insignificant. No doubt from a Christian standpoint, it is all the more important. But I think in our conversations with colleagues, this is an important point to bring up. Conversations with people who may not be believers. Let's talk a little bit more about the recent history, keeping an eye on time. Carter left us with a set of laws in Canada, first a set of laws whereby MAiD is being provided in the context where there is foreseeable death, and only in that context, where patients have to ask for euthanasia on one day, but then go through a 10-day reflection period, because we discovered, and we definitely know now, that many people can change their mind during this 10-day. Additional quote unquote safeguards included the fact that there would be 2 independent MAiD assessors, the fact that there would be protection of coercion by requesting 2 independent witnesses, so people who know you, who realize that you're speaking freely and without coercion. The problem is that over the last 4 years, we've discovered that oftentimes the 10-day reflection period is waived with no justification, but also no consequence, right? So an overzealous euthanasia provider, MAiD provider, can decide to euthanize you before the 10 days have gone up, but there won't be a single judge in this country that will make a fuss about that. We've discovered that the MAiD assessor group is actually a very small group of physicians, and there's a bit of a clique phenomenon, and they'll never disagree with each other. So in fact, having 2 MAiD assessors is kind of useless. We have now suggested in the upcoming Bill C7, that I'll be speaking about some more, that we won't have 2 independent witnesses. We will only ask for 1 witness, and that witness doesn't even have to be outside of the medical team. So the witness now in the future Bill C7 can be someone who is hired, someone who works for the hospital, someone who is your personal support worker at home, hired by home care services. And the rigorous system of monitoring and review that we had been promised, well, that simply does not exist. Right? Most of these cases go unnoticed. And there again, there's a vested interest in not having too much light shed on how MAiD is being provided in Canada. But once you buy into the idea that euthanasia is good and that it's the solution to existential suffering, anything that is a solution to existential suffering, or any suffering for that matter, should be done. And so we are moving with exceptional speed, I'll use the term exceptional twice, from the notion that euthanasia is exceptional to it being normalized and a routine option for death. So much so, in fact, that it is now not so much the patients that have to ask for euthanasia, but often physicians that will actually present it on the menu, which is a whole other problem that we could get into. There have been court challenges suggesting that people who may want to be killed and who are not currently eligible under the current law are saying, well, the law needs to be broadened because how come I can't benefit from this wonderful thing that is euthanasia? There have been non-restrictive interpretation of eligibility criteria. I've talked about the fact that the MAiD assessors and MAiD providers have been bending the rules and no one is challenging them. And then they're telling us this is not really an expansion of our law that we're talking about. It is simply a maturing of the understanding of what we're doing. And that maturing understanding, I'll tell you, is euthanasia is great. After we're done, we haven't received any complaint, right? And we've not heard of any suffering happening after the euthanasia has been completed. And then, of course, there was the Quebec Superior Court that delivered the Truchon case decision, whereby it struck down the central criterion, or it asked for the striking down of the central criterion for reasonably foreseeable natural death. And indeed, if euthanasia is helpful, why wouldn't you want to help more people? So let's talk a little bit about Bill C-7. Bill C-7, as you may know, had been proposed in, I'm not a political expert, so my terms may be off, but it had been proposed in Parliament before, just before the COVID pandemic. It had to fold as Parliament ceased to meet, and it has now promptly been put back on the agenda and is in the works of being finalized. And from the various sessions that I actually listened to, because some of my close Catholic physician colleagues testified, and other disability group leaders that I follow testified in front of our elected leaders, I discovered that this is just happening at a crazy pace, and that any sound argument that is presented to oppose the bill are being promptly ignored. And so, I'm not particularly optimistic, I will admit, in the political sphere at this particular time of our history. But let's talk about Bill C-7. So Bill C-7 primarily has two suggestions. On one hand, it wants to create a second stream of euthanasia, completely distinct from what has existed until now, whereby there would not need to be a reasonably foreseeable natural death. So long as you are having suffering that is not acceptable to you, even if there exists maybe mental health issues that you could explore, you need to be informed that there's such a thing as psychiatrists around, and that psychiatrists can help with your suffering, but you don't need to actually meet a psychiatrist to be eligible. You need to be informed that it might be chronic pain specialists, but you don't actually need to meet them, and so on and so forth. Whatever you're suffering, if you deem that you have it and you're not really interested in pursuing treatment, it is enough to qualify. Now, with that comes a 90-day reflection period, so a bit more than the 10-day that I was speaking about before for the first stream. But keep in mind, while 90 days is more than a week, it's much less than the average wait time to meet a psychiatrist in Canada or to meet a chronic pain specialist in Canada. And when you have that in mind, it's completely ludicrous. How could you make the time to euthanasia, which is irreversible, shorter, significantly shorter than the time to meet a psychiatrist, right? It's not honest. There's something profoundly biased and skewed in this regard. So that's the first aspect of this, this additional push for euthanasia in Canada, that we don't need to be dying. It is no longer medical assistance in dying, in fact, not even if you were to accept that term, which we've already seen is not great. It's really just medically administered death. And the acronym for that is MAiD, and I think that's a very nice coincidence. The second dimension is that the first stream, the one that we've been practicing, the type of euthanasia we have been practicing for people with reasonably foreseeable natural death, is going to be liberalized and accelerated. So you can remove the 10-day criteria, and it no longer has to be done in a covert fashion as it is now. And you also, as I mentioned, you don't need to have the same kind of independent witnesses to prevent coercion. This means that you could receive today a diagnosis of metastatic lung cancer, where your prognosis is somewhere between 1 and 2 years, for example, And because that is a terrible news, and because you're in shock, and because you can't imagine coping with it, you would say the words, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible. I want to die." Someone could hear you say, "Ah, well, I understand that you're feeling this way. We have something called MAiD. Are you interested?" And in the same day, and this would be legal, you would receive euthanasia. This is what the new revised first stream would be able to provide to our Canadians, completely neglecting, basic psychology and the fact that, in fact, through human suffering, people can actually make enormous leaps. If you speak to anyone who has had chronic illness, you realize that, in fact, much of the greatest strides of human existence happens through suffering. We are throwing all that in the garbage so that we don't have to go through suffering. And we as a society, perhaps more importantly, don't have to accompany the suffering. On the horizon, mature minors, euthanasia by advance directives. For the sake of time, we won't talk about that. In merely 4 years, euthanasia was normalized and is to be imminently expanded. Pro-life positions have effectively been silenced through shame, through media collusion, through inadequate formation. There was more than 1,000 physicians who wrote a statement made to MAiD. The link will be presented later. And we tried as a group of more than 1,000 Canadian physicians to reach out to the media. Really, no secular media wanted to hear from us at all. There's a few religious media outlets that were willing to publish something, but the degree to which the media wanted to silence any form of resistance to the Bill C7 was itself deafening. And realistically, speaking in favor of life in our culture, in our professional circles, in our with university elites and so on, is essentially akin to suggesting that you think that everything that the NRA, is that the proper term for the gun association in the US? I mean, you're basically taking on the most politically incorrect position if you suggest that you think there's something to the pro-life position. We are not in a society where there is true dialogue. This is an important slide, a slide that should cause our chins to shake and our hearts to squeeze. And it's about this false notion of choice, okay, that I want to highlight quickly. I realize I'm using a bit more time. Assisted suicide on one hand and suicide prevention programs on the other hand. There's no true choice. Maybe the people who are the architect of our euthanasia in Canada are people with means and education, and they may perceive that this is an interesting choice for them. But the reality is we're creating a society where the most vulnerable are gradually being pushed towards assisted suicide. And it frees us from having to actually build the systems to assist them in a way that would be much more certainly time-consuming, resource heavy, and yes, costly. The little orange box here says, this is in the name of the choice, but choice for whom? Certainly not for the most vulnerable. And what does this paradox say about us, right? So we really have to ask ourselves, when you have simultaneously a society that believes, and it believes genuinely, that we should have suicide prevention programs, and yet it has assisted suicide, what that suggests is that as a society, we have come to believe that really certain lives are worth saving. That 25-year-old woman who's going through a bad depression, maybe a breakup, and is not seeing the end of the light, we should help that woman. But the frail, elderly, with lots of comorbidities, who lives in the long-term care facility, when they ask to die, yeah, we kind of get it. Why wouldn't you want to die, right? This will be our answer. Our answer will be, yeah, you're right. Your life isn't worth living anymore. So let us help you. And that is a very, very dark place for us to have reached. This is a Band-Aid solution. We know from the horrific reports that took place during this time of pandemic that, in fact, there are horrible situations in our long-term care facilities. And when people in these horrific long-term care facilities are reaching a dark place in their heart, rather than to say, well, no, it's because we're not properly looking after them and we need to improve the quality of our long-term care facilities, we need to have better social services. Well, no, there's a much better option. It's called euthanasia, right? Catherine Frazee, who was the Ontario human rights officer for a number of years, and wrote, "Expanding medically assisted death for those who have some disability makes us a special case for ending a difficult life. This categorically sends one and only one message: we are not needed." In Canada, we are willing to use organ and tissue donations from people who receive euthanasia, who undergo euthanasia. And so you can imagine that when you're reaching a point where you don't think that your own life has too much value and you're losing hope, and someone says, well, if we euthanize you could save 7 lives. We could use your heart, we could use your lungs, we could use your kidneys, you could use your liver. And you might think that I'm just speaking like this because I'm anti-euthanasia, I'm pro-life, so I'm very biased. These are real conversations happening with real people who are already hopeless. And of course, the notion that out of their hopelessness, their death could bring some good to others is a very nice little nudge at the end of the road. This is a reality in Canada. And because of that, the scientific literature is even talking about new strategies. Maybe we should use different recipes for how we kill people. Use of potassium chloride, for example, to minimize ischemic time. That means time where the organs are not receiving blood flow and oxygen and so on, so that the organs are in better quality so that we can save other lives better, eliminating more and more people. There's a desire to conflate palliative care with euthanasia, that at the end of the day, the most important part of palliative care is in fact euthanasia. I use this slide from the Canadian Medical Association Journal, where it talks about general guidelines on Parkinson's disease. This is basically like evidence-based stuff, it's all good stuff. But you can see in the choice of how the authors are presenting the notion of palliative care, that the only explicit description they give for types of interventions in palliative care that are important is medical assistance in dying. Take home point number 5, a concern for control and choice no doubt motivates the promoters of euthanasia, but there is no such choice for the vast majority of the frail, the disabled. It allows us not to pursue other avenues to address the high care needs and existential or emotional suffering of the vulnerable. Okay, we have, I realize I'm already at 2:45. Maybe I will say that there's an excellent document that came out from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith entitled Samaritanus Bonus, and you probably shouldn't be receiving pastoral tips from a layman, but those of you who visit the sick, and hopefully that's essentially all of you, if not most, or at least most of you, this is a letter that I would recommend. It has stuff that we know from a long time that is basically represented from previous similar documents, but has 3 points that I wanted to highlight. The fact that the entire Christian community is responsible for providing care for the suffering. The fact, and then some more delicate questions around, the delicate following of patients in a situation where they may be asking for euthanasia. And at the end of the day, the core message is that, of course, the church should be following everyone and lending a loving visit to anyone, no matter their circumstances, including if they request euthanasia. But the use of the sacraments cannot be used in that context. And the document says, to delay absolution is a medicinal act of the church intended not to condemn, but to lead the sinner to conversion. And I thought that was important because there can be some temptations to follow shortcuts that aren't ultimately holy. Maybe a last 5 minutes on what we are called to do, and then we'll have some time for questions. Back to basics, really. In many ways, this should be perceived as a big punch in the face, telling us, like, what have we been doing for the frail? What have we been doing for the sick? Because people are suffering. There is tons of existential suffering out there. There is tons of emotional suffering out there. And what are we doing as a local church community to help the sick in our local retirement home, in our local long-term care facility? Oftentimes not very much. If we think of, 100 years ago, back home in Ukraine, I'm sure many of us can think like, oh no, like when my grandfather was older, the family was around them and they were getting visits regularly, lots of, the whole village was coming and the priest was coming. So many of our frail and elderly patients are in total loneliness, are in despair. And we have relegated them, of course, to these facilities that oftentimes we don't have to go to. But in fact, we are to go to them. because our Lord calls us to. And he tells us, in fact, that even on Judgment Day, these are the kind of things that he's going to tell us about. So maybe, maybe I am tempted to read Matthew 25:40. And the king will answer to them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. And really many of the people that are being concerned by euthanasia, they are the least of these. They are the most fragile members of society. Patients, loved ones, clinicians, and society in general, and that of course includes our church, our churches, our parish societies, are enriched when when the medical teams and the whole community show true compassion through ongoing committed relationship with each suffering person, no matter how difficult the circumstances and complicated the issue. I really think that largely euthanasia is the technical world answer to a problem that really isn't technical. These people need a helping hand. They need someone to walk beside them. Sometimes through our presence and our embrace and our encouragement, much of their suffering can be eased. But even if it isn't eased, we owe it to them to share the burden and to just walk alongside them, something we are often not doing, right? And so there's a real call for change for us here. And of course, it's the one exemplified by the Good Samaritan, which was the title of the document that I alluded to. Many in the medical field, talk about what we should be doing on the political front, and indeed, there's a role for that. And I put the CDF quotes there. And Christians should be trying to push society in a holy direction. At the same time, I also I'm always worried of people who put too much hope in political solutions, and the second antiphon, which we don't always sing, I realize is a good one, because in Psalms 145 we read, "Put not your trust in princes and the children of men, in whom there is no salvation." Anyway, what can we do concretely, other than, I think most importantly, which would be to visit the sick more? Well, we can communicate with our MP. The link is there, and this slide can be shared, of course. We should be educating ourselves around this Bill C7 that is currently being passed in government, and there's still time to tell your MP, like, I don't think you should be voting for this. To get a better understanding of it, you can go to the MAiD to MAD website, and you can support the Physicians Alliance Against Euthanasia's initiative by saying, yes, I'm a Canadian and I'm not for this. Take home point number 6, euthanasia requests should be first heard as a cry for help by the suffering. I intentionally wrote a paraphrase, we should hear it as someone saying, I am sick and in prison and you do not visit me. And therefore we have to act, because we don't want to hear that on Judgment Day. And I'm not saying the reason to do it is not to be punished, but it's because it's our Lord calling us to do it. Let us renew our commitment to visit the sick. There's a huge ministry opportunity that is not being tackled here. Visits in hospital, visits in long-term care facilities, visits in complex continuing centers, continuing care centers, and visits in retirement homes. Let us shamelessly defend life from conception to natural death, and above all, share the good news for the life of the world, because I really believe that at the end of the day, so much of the cloud that prevents many of our fellow Canadians from seeing why this culture of death is wrong is lifted only when the light of faith comes into our lives. And so we cannot lose our evangelization, our zeal for evangelization. In the contrary, this should push us to be bolder. And apologizing that I went above time, this is my last slide. Questions?
All right, so if you had a question, it would be great if you could raise your hand, which I think you can do, or can you not? Yeah, you should be able to raise your hand. On the participants, I'll also allow you to unmute. I will take the risk. So please don't speak over each other. There you go. You should be able to unmute now. If someone does have a question, you could unmute yourself. Please, one at a time.
Well, actually, do you want to guide the questions, or my screen is not.
Yeah, I'll moderate them. Yeah, as long as someone raises their hand or put in the chat box they have a question.
I see a few hands up.
Okay, it's weird that I don't see them. Okay, whoever you see.
Okay, so so I think
Oh,
Father Deacon Paul is one that I see.
okay, go for it. Sorry, I don't know why I don't see that on my screen.
Yeah, Pascal, thank you. Thank you very much for that talk. I have one question, because you were talking about how a doctor could be, must agree or must refer someone by law. So I was, if they're not willing to do it themselves, has any doctor actually been disciplined or charged with refusal to refer?
No, so as of yet, there has not been formal actions taken against physicians. I think that while it is definitely in the college's policy that I showed you, there would likely be a significant turmoil, meaning I'm sure that it would attract some local attention that is not really desirable. I think from a political standpoint, I think it would raise too much awareness about this policy. But as time goes on and people become all the more desensitized to the evil of euthanasia, as we have as a society become so profoundly desensitized to the harm of abortion, I think that things could change. And certainly in terms of medical school admissions, it is now perfectly kosher, I will use the term intentionally, to ask questions in a medical school interview where you would ask the candidate how they would behave in a certain context. And if they tell you that they're going to do something that the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario deems not professional, you have grounds to say, well, we can't accept this candidate because they are not professional. And and there are definitely examples of that right now. So so for and of course that's the explicit one, and then there's the more covert type of discrimination that can happen, which I suspect is real, but I don't have as much data.
Thank you.
I think Father Trulli has a question.
I just wanted your opinion. We have volunteers in our parish who visit our own people in nursing homes or in the hospital, but more often in nursing homes. And they sometimes know that there are people in the nursing home that are not visited by anyone. Like the last year, the nurses will say no one has. And is there a legal problem with our volunteers beginning to visit people like that? Is that kind of frowned upon, or our church is trying to co-opt people? Like how is that done anywhere by any church groups?
So I know of little groups of people who do visit to the sick, and to be honest, the ones I know go to places that they have built relationship with. And in the case of Ottawa, for example, Bruyère is a hospital that is historically a Catholic hospital, and they're probably more open to that. But I think at the end of the day, if we don't visit the people who have not received visitors in a year, it really should be because we're told it's illegal. And we should ask. I mean, so if there is the manpower, if someone is available, says, I'm a volunteer, and I'd be willing to take time to visit this person I don't know because they're so lonely, I would encourage them to just ask, right? So you ask the authorities, and of course the person would be allowed to say, no, I don't want to receive visitors. And if they were to say that, I'm sure we would be asked to respect their right to remain alone. But I will do that in the hospital sometimes, where I realize I have patients who have no family, and then I go to this, the secretary at the front, the unit coordinator, and I say, can you call the volunteers department in the hospital? They always have these high school students who maybe want to do medical school later on, or people who are there to explore the hospital environment, and there's not always tons of work for them. This is the most important thing they could be doing. They don't need to be volunteering in the gift shop. We can hire people to work in the gift shop, really. They should be visiting the sick. And I think, so this is true of the existing volunteers. Father, I would say we should be encouraging people in our churches to make this more of a priority, because it's not on our radar. I think on our, like, maybe I'm only speaking of myself and the people I know, but I feel like if I was not in medicine, I would not be thinking of visiting the sick. And I think of myself as a, you know, good guy. We need to be reminded that there's a cry for help, but it's not heard because we've created a society where this is so isolated. And so we should look for opportunities. We should ask for permission. And I think only if the law totally says, no, you can't, should we stop.
Pascal, we have a question in the chat box. To what extent is this aggressive push to liberalize euthanasia motivated by money?
People often bring that up. You know, I'm sure that it's a secondary gain. It's it sweetens the deal, I think, for our ruling class. But the real question, like, first they had to lose the belief that there was inherent sanctity to human life, and they really did lose that belief. First, they really became convinced that these lives aren't worth living, and so it's okay to dismiss them. Because if they believed it was worth it, I mean, they're still trying. I think they're so mistaken, but they're trying. If they thought they were, like, they don't think they're going around with a machine gun eliminating innocent people, right? To save money. I'm sure it's gonna, it basically removes a headache for them because they have their financial constraints, which are very real and problematic. And this is maybe a win-win situation in that regards. I really don't think it's the primary motivator. I think that the first defeat was our understanding of the human person, and the rest followed.
Father Lazoric had a question.
Thank you so much. You know, we're living in such a secular society that make people believe that I'm a good person and I don't need God to know that, right? I can still be a good person without God. And euthanasia is more understood as a kindness to me, right? So how can I use a reasonable, logical, right, argumentation to say, well, that's still not proper to do. I cannot use any religious arguments because the person says, those arguments are not important to me. I believe I'm a good person, and this is kindness. Would be very difficult to argue on the basis of just a logic and reason with such a secular thinking.
So I think that perhaps so you're correct. It is more difficult, but that's perhaps one reason why I brought up that picture of the suicide prevention and assisted suicide, because our society still believes in suicide prevention, even though we believe in autonomy. Mm-hmm. When someone says, "I want to die," we actually put that through a filter. We're like, is this someone to whom we should be offering suicide prevention? Or is this someone to whom we should be providing assistance? And if you go back to that point, then you have to ask yourself, well, what do I use to discriminate? And more and more from this Bill C7, now Bill C7 says, like, pretty much any suffering that you deem is unacceptable. And so it forces us to realize we're making that decision based on how we view their own lives. Like, it is us judging their life that determines how we treat them. That should be scary to most people, even in a secular context, because for whichever reason, the secular context still believes that there's value in preserving the life through suicide prevention. Like, if we really were to say, you know, these are just molecules floating around in a completely, you know, materialistic viewpoint to the nth degree, we'd say, well, who cares if people commit suicide? There would be some inherent logic to that, but we don't say that. As a secular society, we still lament the 18-year-old who took an overdose. Why? And so I would confront them with that paradox, which I don't think there's a good answer to. There is a book coming out, addressing more of that question, by Stephanie Connors, Stephanie Connors, And so maybe we can keep in, this book is coming out imminently, and it's written very much, it's written very much for people of all backgrounds. And she uses so many human examples of people who have encountered suffering and who have reacted differently to it, for example. Most of her arguments are not based in faith, and they are compelling because they are also not overly theoretical. They are concrete examples that people can relate to. I think that there's much to be said about the fact that we value as a society people who have suffered a lot and who have been able to overcome their suffering and do something great with their life. You go on YouTube or you listen to TED Talks and you see all these people with disabilities who have done extraordinary things, and we're watching them saying, wow. But in this world where we say on day one of your disability, you can die, many of them tell us, if I had been able to ask for euthanasia on the first day I learned my diagnosis, on the first day after my accident, I would have asked for it because I was desperate, right? But society at that time said, no, let us help you. Let's do physiotherapy one day at a time. We're going to be with you walking along the way. And with external help, maybe with God's grace, and certainly with their own strength, they were able to accomplish these things which now all of us look at and are in awe. But it's because we gave them the opportunity to overcome that, and we walked with them. I fear that there are people that we just don't want to walk along with.
I think
Father Peter Galadza has a question.
Thank you.
Father Peter, I'll ask you to unmute. Father Peter, you're on. Okay, we will even come back to Father Peter. And there is a question from in the chat box from St. Elias. Would it be of benefit to saving lives for the CMA to rejoin the WMA? A Google search shows the 2018 CMA departure from the WMA was exclusively as a result of plagiarism.
How interesting. So so the official line of the Canadian Medical Association, I alluded to it quickly for the sake of time, but I'm happy to describe it. The official party line was that the CMA was leaving the WMA because the then new president of the WMA, who was an Israeli man who spoke, I think, 6 languages and who was speaking in his 4th language of choice, which is English, had a speechwriter who used one line out of the speech that the Canadian former WMA president had used in a speech. And so there was, in fact, I'm told, plagiarism, 1 or 2 lines of it, in one speech of one WMA leader who was only a leader for 1 year. And because of that, the CMA claims that they had adequate cause to leave the association altogether and never try to come back to it, even when that guy is actually fired, and even though he didn't write his own speech. And so if you ask anyone who was physically present in Reykjavik, which is where the meeting was taking place in Iceland that year, no one who was there believes that this is true. Because they saw the dynamic play out. They saw Canada say, we need to change the code of ethics. The world says no. You know, an hour later, the guy does his speech, and Canada hears it, leaves, and claims that their departure is due to the plagiarism. Again, I could show you some published articles on the topic where a very powerful claim is made that this is not the real reason. And I mean, I try to convince yourself that it's possible to leave because of the plagiarism of one line. It doesn't. Why would you? You should be trying to maybe have an actual statement retracted, or maybe some consequences to this president. Maybe he should step down as president. But you don't leave the association altogether if you believe that the association is good. But it's part of the political game that's at play. Father Peter, you're now visible.
Father Peter has rejoined us, so maybe Father Peter, you have a question.
No, sorry, I was. Sorry. I had my phone on. Hold it.
You can't have both.
I know.
Maybe it's still on.
Can you? Are we still getting feedback?
Go for it.
Okay. Pascal is always fantastic, over the top, super. My question, and I may have missed this when you were talking about media coverage and the way in which, of course, our open society is not all that open. Obviously, mainstream media is not going to warm up to this, but I'm wondering, have you had a chance to present on Salt and Light? Because I mean, this is the kind. I mean, this is an A+ presentation by someone who's got not only the the brains but also the credentials. Because I had to miss the first 2 minutes, so I don't know whether Father Alex mentioned that. I mean, you're former chief of internal medicine, head of internal medicine at North York General Hospital. So I mean, the credentials speak for themselves. So my first question is. Has Salt and Light invited you to do an extensive presentation? And then secondly, just by way of gratitude to Father Alex and Bishop Brian Beda for organizing this. I mean, I think this is really fantastic. Is there a way for us, at least in our own church, to make sure that this kind of presentation makes its way into other eparchies, of different deaneries, et cetera, because it's just far too valuable to keep under a bushel.
Well, Father Peter, thank you. The short answer is no. I have made similar presentations in various forums, but I've never made a presentation to Salt and Light. There might be other very capable physicians from other Catholic guilds that may have. I'm not aware. I would be open to it if they felt there was a need. And obviously, I'm happy to any other eparchy or group of clergy or group of lay people who want to hear. Obviously, I see it as part of my vocation. I chose internal medicine, perhaps deep in the back of my mind, with reassurance that I wouldn't have to confront these issues of life. I was aware of the difficult situation for family physicians and OBGYN specialists, and I thought, well, at least I won't have to deal with abortion, because in internal medicine we only deal with adults and we don't deal with pregnancy very much. But then the country changed and our laws changed, and my patients became the prime target for euthanasia, which I think is going to be which is changing how care is delivered and how illness is understood and how our patients are seen. And so the vocation came to me, and I'm trying to answer the call. So I'll say yes if someone else wants to hear.
Great. Well, not seeing any other questions or hand raised. Want to thank Pascal, Dr. Bastien, for this great, very informative talk. I know a lot of us have found it of great interest, and probably will look forward to the YouTube link so that we can share it with other people who weren't able to be here today for various reasons. We're going to have other talks in this series. As I mentioned, we're looking to have one on hospital ministry in the time of COVID already planned, another one coming up about pornography addiction with one of our Massey alums as well, that one. So just to thank everyone for your attention today, to please stay on our website to see what's coming up. And most of all, about this specific topic, to please contact your MPs, right? To let your positions be known and to speak out, right? Catholics are a large political presence in this country, but we don't organize ourselves like that, which is always a great contrast to how we see across the border. But to speak out and to visit the sick, as Pascal suggested for us, I think that's a great call for all of us as we enter or are perhaps already in St. Philip's Fast, a great work of mercy we can do to visit the sick, to let them know. I think especially during this time of COVID, when so many are extremely isolated for precautions, that they are really sometimes distraught. Thank you everyone for coming, and God bless you all.